All right, so we're getting to 10 o'clock. I want to make sure I am respectful of your time. My name is Gus. Um, I see Julian, and it says Rob Wright, but I can't imagine. Is Rob the right name? You're muted.
It's Rob Lynn.
Oh, Rob Lynn. There you go.
Right.
Nice.
Right.
Very nice to meet you. So, what office are you from?
Yours.
Oh, you're
And
in this office. Have we met?
uh-huh. And I wanted to meet you several different times, but you were unavailable. And I
Oh,
wanted
I'm sorry.
to introduce myself and share with you that I've spent my entire life in commercial real estate.
Oh my goodness. You should teach this
Yes.
class.
No, well, I don't know about that, but I'm a CSM. I have managed and leased shopping centers all of my life.
Oh, that's
Super,
awesome.
pardon me?
I said that's awesome. You definitely have more experience than I do. So I'll be picking your brain. I might be picking your brain for some of this class.
Well, okay. I
That's
shouldn't have said
awesome.
anything.
Oh no. I'm gonna put you on the spot.
Let me ask you a question. How
Yes,
much
ma'am.
uh, activity are you experiencing? One of the reasons why I didn't go commercial, I'm new to Florida, very new to
Okay.
Florida, was because of the fact that one, it takes a very long time, typically for most transactions,
Yeah,
um, very long. And on top of that, um, I didn't, given the economy, it just didn't look like it was viable.
sure. That's fair. Without getting too much in the weeds, because this is going to be really a fundamentals class, but without getting too much into the weeds, one of the reasons or one of the things that we're seeing in the market, we're definitely seeing a slowdown in activity. I mean, I think that's all around.
Right,
Everyone's nervous about the economy, so on and so forth. But what I would say that is, like anything, there's always opportunity, right?
right,
So the opportunity that I'm seeing, that we're seeing in Florida, is specifically around industrial, just because of warehousing and distribution is really in a growth market, primarily because when whether you agree with his politics or not, when DeSantis opened up the ports of entry during COVID, it opened up sort of Pandora's box in a good way with regard to distribution in Florida. And this offered an opportunity for Florida to kind of recognize that they can be a distribution center for the East Coast. And we've been seeing a ton of development with regard to industrial and distribution across Central Florida. If you, as a matter of fact, Groveland, that the 27 and Turnpike corridor in Groveland, that area is exactly 4 hours from, no more than 4 hours from every major city in the state of Florida. So that corridor actually has a ton of growth happening in the industrial sector in particular. In addition to that, we have Space Coast, which is building obviously rocket ships and putting rockets in the air. We're probably about 5 years away from commercially viable rocket travel, not necessarily for people, but for things, right? If I need to get something to Dubai or to China by lunchtime, that's actually a viable possibility with rocket travel. So by adding essentially a brand new branch, which we haven't seen a new branch in our distribution network since the invention of the airplane. This is going to really make an impact in Florida being a major player in terms of distribution. So industrial is a really major growth opportunity in Central Florida in particular. I would also say because we're pretty heavy in retirement communities. A lot of people come here for retirement. Health sciences has been a huge growth sector for commercial. So there's a lot of health and wellness, medical office space that we're seeing having a lot of growth opportunities. A lot of doctors are expanding their practice. These are really, really great tenants because they tend to, pay a premium. They tend to stay a long time. I'm sure you're familiar with some of this, some of the things that I'm
Always
saying.
love doctors and dentists. Always,
Yeah.
always. Yeah.
So, these are really great tenant opportunities for landlords. And of course, a lot of them are even considering purchasing if the financials make sense. So I think in particular, I think the office space has a lot of potential, primarily because of that medical component. And I think there's also, because there's still a high demand for housing, I think there's opportunity to convert office into multifamily lofts or multifamily opportunities as well. So I think there's a great opportunity in the office space, as well as a really growth
And
opportunity.
industrial.
Yeah, and industrial. I
Yeah,
think those
there
two
doesn't
sectors.
look like there's a lot of retail. I've been very surprised at the lack of retail. Very surprised.
Yeah, I mean, retail has slowed down. I think throughout the entire nation. I will say Florida has outperformed most areas as it relates to retail. I will say that's not saying much, considering how much retail has slowed down. So I personally would not, if I were an investor right now, I would not necessarily be looking at retail.
No.
Unless I had some long-term play that I figured was going to make some sense for me sometime in the distant future. I think the opportunities, at least for me, in my business, is where I'm focusing on is I'm focusing on office and industrial. Those are the two sectors where I am really developing a specialization because I happen to like those two sectors. But I also think that there are some really great opportunities in both of those sectors for different reasons.
Right.
So that's my 2 cents on what's happening in the commercial market as to whether or not there's an opportunity there or not. So it is certainly much more difficult to find business now than it was even a year ago. So,
right.
But business is still there. There's still business there. We are seeing a lot of we're seeing a lot of movement with tenants too. So businesses are starting up or expanding, so there's a lot of tenant activity that's happening, even though sales are not necessarily moving quite as fast. So it's an interesting market. But my interest right now, where I think there's an opportunity is specifically in industrial and office space.
Right.
So. All right, so I want to kind of get into this because we only have an hour, and I want to make sure that we cover everything. We're just going to be talking about this class is really to kind of get you guys familiar with what commercial is in a nutshell. I'm going to be focusing today on property types. I think it's important for everyone to understand what property types there are in commercial. We're going to really be talking about the core 4 types of properties that you can find in commercial, and get you guys to understand how to recognize them, and maybe some resources to kind of get more familiar about how to find more information about the particular property types. Now, commercial is pretty vast and covers a lot of different things. So I would say that there's no way to, in one class, give you all the insights on what it is that commercial is about. This is going to be an ongoing process. I'm sorry. This is going to be an ongoing learning process. If you've done if you've done any kind of real estate at all, even in the residential sector, that you're learning something every year, right? Every year there's something new. Every transaction there's something new. Commercial is no different. Just make it exponential, right? It's something new all the time, and every specialization that there is. and things are constantly evolving. The big thing that I would really emphasize as it relates to commercial, if you do have an interest in commercial, is that all of the protections that are in place as you see it for residential do not exist in commercial. It is a buyer beware market. There's no disclosures that are required. There are, all the due diligence is put on the buyer. The risk is put on the buyer. Now, typically the seller, has an incentive to provide all of the proper information because they obviously want to sell the property, but it is on the buyer to identify what is going to be in their best interest for a particular purchase, which is why you typically see these really long due diligence windows. Why you hear these conversations of, oh, it's going to take 6 months or 9 months to close, a year to close. Like, that's not unusual. I just closed a deal in August, and that particular deal took 14 months to close. So, due diligence is a big deal because the buyer who's buying the property has to make sure that they can actually do the thing that they want to do on property. So it's really important that due diligence is taken seriously. So, all right. The other thing that I do want to say, this is from our broker and our OP. Really want to emphasize Article 11 of the NAR's Code of Ethics, basically just kind of breaking down it. Each realtor, if you're going to specialize, that's great. You need to be able to specialize if you're going to operate in any capacity. So commercial is considered a specialization. If you are going to do commercial, you want to make sure that you have a specialization or you're partnering with someone who has a specialization in commercial. One would even argue that even within commercial, there are specializations with specific categories. You may want to even look into specializing in a particular category. I will say this applies even to, like, I know a lot of residential agents do land. Land is considered a specialization, so just be careful. Just know that if you're going to get into commercial or land or any of these other specializations that's specified by NAR, that you're going in eyes wide open, and just make sure that you're just kind of aware of what risks that are involved in specialization. Okay, so that's just a CYA. All right, so what is commercial real estate? Obviously it refers to properties that are used exclusively for business purposes, income in some capacity, right? Some kind of income or business purposes. Unlike residential real estate, which is intended for personal living space, commercial real estate is designed to generate income through leasing or rental agreements with businesses, or for an owner-operator to operate their business out of the actual space. There are some classifications that you guys should be familiar with regard to commercial space. This would apply to all of the different categories of commercial. There are sort of Class A, Class B, and Class C designations. These are sort of loose and fast classifications. A lot of it's kind of subjective, but there are some rules of thumb. So, for example, Class A, these are sort of top tier properties, often located in prime business districts. They have high quality finishes, state-of-the-art systems, typically are very well maintained, and usually attract really high profile tenants, typically command the highest rents in the area. Class B, these properties are sort of functional. They're usually pretty well maintained, but usually they tend to be older. They tend to, they may have been built 5 to 10 years ago, but they're usually well maintained, may lack some amenities that you might find in a Class A property. And rents tend to be a little bit more moderate for these buildings just because they're older. Oftentimes they're utilized for second gen uses, which second gen just basically means that it had somebody in it at one, prior, and then now the new tenant is coming in to take over the same space. And then Class C, this is going to typically be a much older building that may require some significant maintenance or upgrades. They often are located in less desirable areas and command the lowest rents of the classes. Sometimes you'll see investors that want to buy Class C or Class B buildings, and then they'll want to improve them to make them Class A or Class B buildings. This is a pretty common practice with investors. This is called forced equity. When you buy a building, you force the value of the building by improving it, making it more desirable, increasing rents, so that the property can ultimately be either flipped or just cash flowing, a better cash flowing property for the owner. All right, so there are going to be subcategories that do exist in all of the categories that we're going to be talking about today. And what I really want you guys to understand is that for example, I'm going to be talking a little bit about industrial properties, which is one of the categories of property types that we see in commercial. And even within industrial, we have heavy manufacturing or heavy industrial. We have light industrial, bulk warehousing, and flex spaces. Right? These are all like subcategories of industrial. And I say that because, what you can do in heavy manufacturing, you're not going to be able to do in a flex space. So, you need to make sure that if you are going to be working in the industrial space, for example, that you understand that, there are these subcategories, and within these subcategories, you're going to need to understand like what's going to be allowable in each of these subcategories. Unfortunately, there's no standard, right? Each of these subcategories, this one says, for example, heavy manufacturing. Sometimes it might just say heavy industrial. Sometimes it might have some other term suggesting a heavy industrial use, right? What is defined as heavy industrial is going to change depending on the municipality that governs the location. So, what is heavy industrial in Groveland may be very different than what's heavy industrial in Lake County, which may be very different than what's heavy industrial in Clermont. And these are all within the same county. The cities, the municipalities themselves will define each of the actual uses and how they can ultimately be used, what's allowable in each of these spaces. So having an understanding of that is going to be important if you're going to be getting into industrial. Oftentimes, when you get started, it's not unusual. This happens with me too. Someone will ask me, "Oh, this is a building. It's heavy industrial use. Am I going to be able to do my business here?" Well, I may not necessarily know exactly, but I do know where to find it. So, I'll usually let my client know, well, let me go ahead and see what I can find out, see what details we can find out about what's allowable in this particular location, what's defined as heavy use in Groveland, for example, and then I'll be able to get back to them and say, okay, well, it looks like, based on what the development code says, we are able to, it does allow for your type of use. So, part of the part of going into any kind of, either whether it's a tenant or a buyer, or even if someone who's selling, is really understanding what the use is for the property, and making sure that you get that definition from the municipality that governs, the use of that property. So that way you can understand whether or not the buyer is going to be able to do the thing that they want to do with it. Okay. Now, there are four major types of properties that exist in commercial. Now, like I said, there are subtypes, but they all typically fit within these four in some capacity. So you have your office space, you have retail space, you have industrial space, and multifamily. So we're going to kind of touch on each of these. And of course, if you guys have any questions about them, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. I'm here just to kind of share with you, what the property types are and what you can expect to see with each property type, and some of the features that you can expect to see with the property types. Office is a property type that we're in right now. So we're in a building, and we're technically in what's called mixed use, a mixed use building, right? Where there's retail on the first floor and there's office on the second floor. Okay. That's not uncommon. We do see that. It's basically a combination of two different categories. But there are a lot of buildings that the only thing that they have are office suites in the entire building. The kinds of businesses that you'll find in these kind of buildings are, like as you would imagine, properties that primarily use office space, like technology companies, professional services, creative agencies, stuff like that. You're not typically going to find a restaurant in an office space. You're not typically going to find a retailer in an office space. Usually it's not allowed. The municipality will typically not allow for that unless it's like a mixed use space like the building that we're in, where they've designated all of downstairs as retail and all of upstairs as office. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So some of the features that are going to be important that you're going to see with office spaces is they tend to have highly flexible workspaces. So most of the walls, for example, are usually easy to move around. They usually, even if they go to the ceiling, they oftentimes won't go past whatever the ceiling, let's say the ceiling tiles, for example, and that's on purpose because every time a new tenant comes in, the landlord wants to be able to easily tear down walls and reconfigure the space for whoever the new tenant is. So typically there's a lot of flexibility with use, or rather with configuration in an office space. And when the landlord wants to make that as easy as possible, oftentimes it's not uncommon for a landlord to cover some of the cost for doing that new configuration. So they want to minimize their cost. And the best way to do that is to make sure that whatever walls they put up are as temporary as allowable, right? So they don't want to put in heavy duty walls that are going to, be indestructible and hard to remove. They want to make the walls as easy to remove as possible, because if they have to do any kind of tenant improvement on the property, they don't want that to be terribly expensive. Okay. So the other thing is that you'll see in office buildings, which is pretty common, is there are multiple levels. So retail buildings typically are one level because usually you want that walking traffic, right? If there are two levels, usually it's because it's part of a mall or some kind of a larger structure or something like that. Office buildings, on the other hand, can go many, many, many levels. You can have a, penthouse suite, 10, 20 stories tall office buildings. Typically we don't see that here in our area because Clermont doesn't have like skyscrapers, but you see some of those taller buildings in Orlando, and of course as you get to bigger cities, larger cities will have really, really tall, high-rise office suites. So that is something that's really nice about office buildings, because from an investor perspective, in the footprint where they can put a building, right? The square footage that you can put on that footprint, you can make it as tall as the city will allow you to build. And that means that you can get rents for as high as the city allows you to build up. Amenities and or utilities are often included in rents. And this is usually because it's just too costly for the landlord to subdivide electrical, for example, across multiple units, especially if they're going to be reconfiguring them all the time, and then who's going to be paying and where the wiring is going to be. So oftentimes, and especially in larger office buildings, you'll see some amenities that will be included as part of the rent. And then the other thing that we also see is it's pretty common to see triple net rents, which basically means that there's a base rent that's paid, which is basically per square foot, and then a triple net, which usually includes property insurance, property taxes, and common area maintenance. But in some cases, you'll also see full service. And full service will include the garbage. We kind of have full service in our office where we have everything taken care of for us. You might pay a little bit for whatever your space is, but everything else is kind of managed for you. You don't have to worry about it. So that's kind of a full service setup where all of the ancillary elements of the property are essentially taken care of for you. So that's not uncommon for office space. Has anyone, Rob, have you done any transactions with office space yourself?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And Is there anything that you've seen based on what I'm kind of mentioning here? Is there any other elements that you've seen that might be important to mention as it relates to office space?
Um, well, I've handled multiple office areas, and the ones that I ran into were multi-level and single level.
Mm-hmm.
Um, had to install a gate in the one single level one, which was somewhat challenging because it was a different situation. But no, I'm thinking that you're covering it. In every one, it was all triple net in every
Yeah,
single one.
that's yeah,
Yes.
that's the most common that we're at least we're seeing that the
It-
same here in our market. Triple net seems to be the most common.
right. So the very few that I've ever been involved with are modified gross or gross.
Mm-hmm.
And so uh, I mean, at the end of the day, it's so expensive for the landlord. Not only from literal expenses, but also from managing that.
Sure, absolutely.
So yeah. So
Okay.
but I'm very interested in your information relative to industrial, because I've had a couple of industrial uh, experiences as well.
Oh,
And
awesome.
yeah, and it kind of gives me a little bit of hope because I didn't have much in the
It's a
commercial realm. I'm looking around and thinking, you got to be kidding me, you know?
I understand that.
So
And
I
listen,
am. Now they
it is a
base it
tough
on
market,
zoning, don't
so
they?
I'm sorry.
They base it on zoning,
What they
correct?
base what on zoning?
As far as use.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's going to be based on
Literal,
zoning.
literal zoning, like
Yeah,
M1 and yet
yeah,
C1
yeah,
and
yeah.
yeah, right. Okay.
Correct.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. So the next category that we see is retail. So retail is your typical apparel store, your restaurants and cafes, grocery stores, supermarkets, electronic stores, stuff like that. So, obviously these are, things that where people go shopping. While offices tend to be very service-based oriented, retail tends to be a mix of service and like merchandise and stuff like that. So, one thing that I like about retail is, retail is probably the prettiest type of property that you're going to find. You typically has the nicest, front storefront and all that other stuff, primarily because it's client facing. This is where customers come and do some kind of activity. So typically they have, the most attractive properties of all of the different property types. Now, some important features that I think are important to note as it relates to retail is that location is typically one of the most important factors to retail. They're very sensitive to both either foot or vehicle traffic. So typically when someone is looking for a retail space, those are some of the important factors that they take into consideration as it relates to whether or not this is going to be a good retail location for their business or for an investment. There usually is a tenant mix. So you'll usually see a combination of, and you guys have seen this in plazas, for example. This is a common retail property where you might have a restaurant that's next to maybe a salon that is next to a medical a doctor, right? So you see kind of a mix for retail where office space tends to be a little bit more specific to office-based style businesses. You might even see in some cases, brokerages that might be in retail spaces. So retail has a little more flexibility with use. Oftentimes they will allow for office space in a retail location, especially if it is a very consumer heavy type of business where consumers are going to be doing walk-ins and stuff like that. So, like I mentioned, the storefront design is usually very appealing for a lot of retailers because they're trying to attract people to walk into their building. So these types of buildings tend to be the prettiest buildings that you find in the different categories. And what we see in our market is we see a lot of triple net and modified gross leases. And basically, triple net, just like I said before, property taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. Modified gross is a little bit different. It basically is usually some combination of, the tenant is responsible for some portion of taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance, and the landlord might be responsible for some other portion. And usually with a modified gross, that is all done as part of a negotiation in the lease, where the landlord's willing to cover some portion of it and the tenant's going to be responsible for some other portion. And that will go tenant to tenant, landlord to landlord on a case by case basis. There's no, like I said, there's no, unfortunately, there's not really a standardized lease arrangement that you see across the board. These are all going to be per negotiation, right? Which is where agents and their ability to understand these negotiations really becomes powerful. In commercial, negotiation is I think a heavier tool in commercial, just because there's so many other moving parts to a negotiation in commercial as compared to residential. So really having a full and deep understanding of how you can negotiate a particular deal in commercial is really going to give you an advantage as a commercial broker going into any kind of negotiations. All right, so industrial is a really interesting animal. I like industrial. It's probably the ugliest of all of the categories, but that's primarily because it's all about function. They don't care about how pretty it is. They don't care about what color the building is. It's strictly functional. When you go into an industrial building, most industrial buildings look very similar to that picture you see there, which is going to be pretty bare bones. It's concrete floors. You see, you see straight to the roof, right? You see all the way through the rafters and everything. It's pretty common, but in some cases they'll enclose that, right? For one reason or another. They may have a need to enclose it, maybe. And some cases, for example, which I didn't mention here, but refrigeration warehousing is something that Florida tends to use a lot because we're so hot here. We are seeing a lot more refrigeration type warehousing, and those are fully enclosed, with both AC and inside, having refrigeration spaces inside of the building itself, oftentimes for distribution purposes. So it tends to be a mix of uses, obviously all industrial specific, including manufacturing, warehousing and distribution, construction and contractors, R&D, which is health sciences, essentially, which we also saw health sciences on the office side. So health sciences will run the gambit, primarily because they have a consumer side, which is going to be your doctors and medical professionals and stuff like that. And then they have the science side where they're manufacturing medicines or doing kind of research to, do kind of, chemistry essentially, right, to figure things out. So the health sciences is a pretty big field, and it encompasses both office and industrial. And we're seeing a lot of that here in Central Florida, just because of the huge retirement community that we have in Central Florida. Machine repair and maintenance is also pretty common. Sometimes you'll see auto repair shops in industrial. What's interesting about auto repair shops is auto repair kind of fits. It's kind of a weird animal because it technically is an industrial type of use, but we will often see it in retail locations. As long as it's approved by the city or the county, depending on who the municipality is, we'll oftentimes see an automotive shop inside of what might be considered a more retail type of use, right, where it's designated as retail, but it's retail auto, right, automotive. So sometimes in the zoning, in the zoning code, even though under other circumstances, if you're doing like repairs on robots or heavy machinery, that would be strictly industrial. When you're talking about cars and motorcycles, because it's very consumer facing, oftentimes cities will designate a retail designation for automotive services. So, specifically for just mechanic shop stuff. When you get into like body work and stuff like that, that goes back into the industrial side, primarily because of the chemicals and environmental implications that come with using the chemicals used for painting cars and doing body work and stuff like that. So it's a really, there are some, while I think, most, we try to categorize as best as possible. Sometimes those categories have to sort of flex a little bit depending on, how consumer facing they are versus how sort of behind closed doors they can get away with. Now, some of the features that we see with industrial spaces is typically they like to have access to highways or ports. This is very, very much the case specifically for distribution centers. Warehousing tends to like that too, because usually the reason why they have a warehouse is because they want to store stuff to be able to then travel it somewhere else. So it might be not necessarily distribution in terms of like part of the supply chain, but it may be a warehouse for their own supplies that they need to store, and then they're going to be distributing their own supplies to their own locations or to any of their work sites. So, oftentimes you'll see like tile vendors will often take a warehouse space, and they have obviously they keep their supply at their warehouse. And then when they have a job, they take their supplies from their warehouse to their job, to the actual job site. So, but they usually want to have access to highways because they want to be able to get to their job site as quickly as possible without having to take a bunch of side roads. Phase 3 power and even some other utilities, phase 3 is probably the most common requirement for industrial. It's actually rare that I find an industrial user who doesn't need phase 3. Phase 3 just allows you to use heavier machinery inside of the space. So it's pretty common to find phase 3 or the ability to put phase 3 power into a warehouse space or any kind of industrial space, especially when you're talking about the larger spaces. Sometimes we see smaller spaces. These are like 1,500 to 2,500 square foot spaces. Those spaces may not necessarily have phase 3 built in, but usually have accessible. These are typically for your small business owner who might have like a small motor, like a small lawnmower shop, or maybe they have a little handyman business or something like that, and they just need to keep their supplies in their specific location. So sometimes they may not necessarily require phase 3 type of power. But when you get into the bigger spaces, usually about 5,000 square feet or larger, usually those users typically have some kind of phase 3 requirement or some other utility. I had a client that I have a client that I'm working with now. They need about 25,000 square feet. They need the phase 3, but they also need a ton of water. So we're actually pulling in what's considered not considered, but what is a 4-inch line, water line from the main line, which a 4-inch line is typically the size of what the main line is. So sometimes they'll get to 6 and 8 inches, but typically it's not bigger than 4. What's normally used in most buildings is a 2-inch line. So that's a line that would have to go all the way out to where the main water line is, and then built into the building. So this is usually a cost that's taken on by the tenant, because usually the landlord's not going to want to pay for something like that because that's a very specific use. But this is an example of having to be able to have access to some utilities that is above and beyond what you might typically see with other building types. Ceiling heights are also a pretty big deal for a lot of industrial use clients. Oftentimes they either need machines that need that height, they need to store, so they want the height for storage, or they will often want to bring in a truck or something inside the building to be able to load and unload. So building height and garage door sizes are usually sort of key elements that people are looking into. So, just be aware that when you're looking for industrial space, you're going to want to know whether the tenant or the buyer needs a specific ceiling height in order to run their business, or for whatever purpose they're going to be using it for. Environmental considerations. This is probably the biggest deal as it relates to industrial. Industrial has the use that has the highest potential for environmental issues. And the reason being is because of the use that is typically allowed for industrial. Industrial is typically who allows, pesticide, use businesses, and your machine shops, and, mechanic, heavy use mechanic shops for cement, for creating cement and distributing cement, for all kinds of uses that could potentially have a negative impact environmentally on the property. Anytime I deal with an environmental property, by far, I make a recommendation to a fault to have the buyer do an environmental study. It tends to be expensive. There's basically 3 phases to an environmental study. The first phase alone typically can cost anywhere from $5,000 to $8,000. Phase 2 can get up into the $15,000 to $20,000. Phase 3 can be upwards of $50,000 depending on the property. But the reason why it's important to have a environmental study on an industrial property is because if there is a problem on the property, if there's an environmental problem, typically it is on the seller to remedy that issue. And if a buyer buys a property and they don't do an environmental study, and there was an environmental issue on the property, they are now stuck with that, and it's going to be on their bill when they go to sell the property later. And in some cases, it will be at a detriment to the buyer, because either the environmental issue is really deeply rooted, or it's been there for so long that they have to go much deeper than they would have had they done that remediation much earlier. It can be very costly, and we're talking not tens of thousands of dollars. We're talking it could be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a remediation, primarily because they have to remove the soil from the location completely, and before they can even start building or doing whatever they want to do on property. So environmental considerations is one of the most important considerations as it relates to industrial. So if you are ever in dealing with an industrial property, that's going to be one of the first things you're going to want to make sure is being taken care of. Of the property types, that I would say have the highest chance for liability to be an issue, I would say industrial is probably at the top. Just because of the environmental potential that exists there alone is a pretty big one. And then there are certain industrial specializations or subcategories that I won't even touch. I'll bring someone else in. Gas station is a perfect example of that. I will not sell.
I was going to say that.
Yeah. I won't touch a gas station with a mile-long pole. I won't. I'll bring in somebody else to manage that, and I'll take a referral happily, because a gas station is one of those kinds of projects that if you don't do it right, you can really mess up your client, and that could be a real problem. So you just want to make sure that you're really careful with the types of property types that you engage with, and that if you are not familiar with a particular property type, that you take the time to find someone who can take care of that client, to make sure that that you are out of the liability from that situation. Take the referral and not the lawsuit. Okay, so the last category we're going to talk about today is multifamily. Multifamily is actually a fun one, because this is actually something that as a residential agent, for those of you who do residential, this is one that is a little easier to understand. because it's for people, right? It's basically a bunch of tiny houses all stuck into one building is essentially what, you can kind of think of it as. But the thing that's important to understand is the buyer is not the same, right? The buyer is not like a home buyer, right? The buyer is looking to buy the building so that other people can make the space their home. The good thing about the thing that is familiar is the fact that these are all essentially where people live, right? And the other thing that's also familiar is how income can be generated, and income is pretty straightforward. It's with leases, your standard run of the mill, monthly rent. There's no triple nets on top of that. There's no other additional anything on top of that. So, with regard to multifamily, it's pretty straightforward when you're talking about traditional apartments. Now, there are some subcategories in multifamily. I dealt with student housing in my previous life. That's an animal in and of itself. Requires a lot of management, and because there's a lot of turnaround. Basically, students are staying in there for the semester, and then they may switch and go into another space the very next semester in the same building. You have 55 plus apartments, which is basically just what you would senior living, right? You got assisted living, which is going to be, with nurses. Usually there's medical staff on property, so on and so forth. And then you have mobile home parks, which technically fit under the multifamily category. And that's because the mobile home park is one property that has multiple units on property. Okay. So, when getting into multifamily housing, it's really figuring out what's going to be. A lot of investors like to get into multifamily. The one thing that I would say about multifamily is that it's usually a pretty big investment, but usually it's because there's a pretty decent return on it. Most investors don't typically see a return for 3 to 4 years, before they actually see a real return. And that's usually because when they buy a multifamily property, it's pretty common for them to buy one that is, unless they're building it, of course, but it's pretty common for them to build a multifamily property that is distressed, and they're taking over a distressed asset. Then they have to take that distressed asset and improve upon it, right? Their goal is to come in, the rents are, let's say, below market, the property maybe needs some updates and upgrades. They're going to come in with some cash, improve the property. As they improve the property, they're going to slowly start replacing those below market rents with at market rents, right? So that they can, improve the value of the property over time, because ultimately the property's value is based on the net operating income. Part of what they may also do is look at the operations of the property to see how the property is operating, see if they can make it more efficient, bring down the cost of operations, right? So the goal is to bring down the cost of operations, increase the income from the property, and that net is what is the calculation to identify ultimately its value. So you see a lot of multifamily properties that will usually hold them for anywhere between 5 and 10 years. 5 years is actually not uncommon. They'll kind of do a 5-year strategy. They come in, it takes them the first 2 to 3 years to kind of get the property up to par. They're now cash flowing. The property, because cash flowing, it's now increased in value. And at year 5, they'll have an exit, right? So that's not uncommon. We're also seeing 10-year exits. So it depends on the investment, how they want to ultimately do their investments. But but multifamily is, it's exciting. We're still seeing a lot of activity in multifamily right now, just primarily because there's still a high demand for housing in Florida. People are still moving here in droves. We're still seeing a lot of people coming to the area, and not enough homes that are available for them. So multifamily is still an active part of our market. It definitely has slowed. We're not seeing as many building multifamily as before. And a lot of that has to do with just a massive investment. And people, I think, are just very nervous about what's happening in the economy, because if there is a significant pullback in the economy, that could have a devastating effect on the ability for multifamily to perform based on whatever their projections were, which is typically called a pro forma, right? So a pro forma is basically a projection of how a property is going to perform based on where the market is. If they have a pro forma based on increased rents over time and the economy decides to pull back and rents don't increase as expected, then that pro forma pretty much is in the garbage and they have to kind of start over from scratch. And that could cost them, the ability to be able to do a reasonable exit after 5 years. And maybe they have to hold for time, or in the worst case scenario, it puts them in a negative position and they have to find a way to get out of it, even if it's at a loss, to cut their losses. So I think there's a lot of just anxiety with what's happening in the market today, which is causing people to kind of not sure whether they should be moving forward with a big project like that. I think that's really interesting. Some important features to note as it relates to these types of properties is number of doors. That's usually a big question for people who are looking to purchase a multifamily. Usually they have an idea of how many doors they want to buy. And the doors is basically it's basically slang for how many units. Okay. They usually want to have access to employment centers. They don't want to be out in the sticks, because if the economy shrinks for whatever reason, then that means people are going to have to drive all that distance to get to work, and they're more likely to want to live closer to where they work. So they'll choose to move closer to where they work, which means that anything that's too far away from any kind of employment centers is going to be difficult to keep from having high vacancies. Amenities and interactive spaces is pretty common with a lot of multifamily spaces. This includes like the pool and workout facility and stuff like that. I will say in this market, what we're seeing, because the economy is kind of in flux and people are nervous, we're seeing a lot of developers that are choosing to effectively build, instead of building a Class A building, they're essentially building a Class B building, but it's brand new. So it feels like a Class A building, right? But has no amenities. So there's no operational costs, or at least it minimizes the operational costs of the building. But you can still command decent rents. Even if it's not necessarily your top tier rents, you're pretty close to it because the building is brand new, the space is brand new. And even though you don't have necessarily a community pool or a workout facility, it feels like a brand new space. And, tenants will pay maybe, slightly higher than what they would do for a Class B apartment, but not quite as much as they would pay for a luxury apartment. But because people are a bit price sensitive, they may be willing to do something like that, right? So they'll take a downgrade on amenities as long as the living space is still pretty good. So you have these sort of people who are living in luxury apartments with all the amenities, paying a premium for that, and they decide, well, this is really too expensive for me. I can move over to the same space, this other building that has similar square footage. I don't get a pool, I don't get the workout space, I don't get some of the other amenities, but the apartment is just as nice. It has all the interior living space that I want, and I'm still close to all the things that I want to be next to. You know what? I'll do that. It's a discount, and I feel like I haven't really downgraded. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now. Population density is also a big deal for most multifamily investors, because the higher the density, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to fill your space, which is why you tend to see multifamily buildings, especially the bigger ones, in city centers, right? That's typically where you see them, because the density is high and it's easy to fill those buildings. Clermont's starting to become a town center. I wouldn't say it's a full city center. We're not quite a city yet, but that's why we're starting to see a lot more multifamily, I would say mid-rises, which is the multifamily buildings that we see in our town. Okay. So do you guys have any questions about any of the categories so far? Because those are the main categories.
I have some. This is a little more complex. Sorry, Wes, I got my retainers in.
No worries.
But, I have a hardware and sporting goods store up in Georgia, and it's an older property. And over the years, me and my brother acquired like properties beside it, which joined.
Awesome.
One was a gas station, an old gas station that we pushed over and we paved the whole parking lot.
Mm-hmm.
We're probably going to sell eventually. So my question was, I know you said you wouldn't touch gas stations. As far as on the environmental end, if I understand you correctly, we can sell that as a retail store and all of that. Do we have to disclose all of the history of everything with each property, or?
So you don't have to disclose, you're not required to disclose anything. There's no requirement for you to disclose. I would say it would be in your best interest to disclose. They're gonna find out. A savvy buyer is gonna find out because
Well, I usually like to be upfront with stuff,
Yeah.
but it would be up to them to do all the environmental.
correct.
study.
Yeah.
And if there's contamination or anything,
Correct.
then we would have to.
That would usually be the responsibility of the seller. Now, it can be negotiated. That is something that can be negotiated if the
Where it's taken out at closing or something like that.
or I mean, if the deal is good enough and the buyer is really motivated, they may be willing to pay for a portion of the remediation.
Mhm.
The other thing, do you know if the tanks were taken out?
No, they were not.
Okay, so there are federal programs. What I would recommend is find yourself a commercial agent in Georgia who specializes in gas stations,
Mhm.
and have them help you with even with the sale, right? Just to work with to help you sell it. Because there are federal programs that may help you with the remediation of the gas station. I had a project that I was working on. I was helping a partner who was working on the project. I wasn't on that project, but there was an old gas station on the building,
Mhm.
and they leveraged a federal program to help with the removal of the tanks and with the remediation of the contamination that was there. So there are programs that are available. You have to
Right.
see if the site qualifies for those programs. But in order to know that, you're going to need someone who's local, who understands, what's going on in the local market, and then also understands how to leverage those federal programs for that particular site. I think it would be in your best interest to start doing that now, because sometimes that can take some time for the federal government to kind of come in and, if they do approve it, it could take time for them to actually go through the process of doing that remediation.
Right.
So-
Okay. That makes sense.
So because and a lot of that came because I think it was in the 90s or something like that. I want to say it was the 90s. They started to realize that the way that tanks started failing because they didn't realize that the way that they were making tanks at the time back in the 40s and 50s when this was all relatively new, that what they had to do to keep them from leaking and what kind of problems they could ultimately cause and so on and so forth. And as they started failing, the federal government said, well, it's not really the fault of the person who owns the property who didn't realize that they need to have different requirements than what they had. So the federal government kind of came in and said, hey, we'll help solve for this, right? So it's part of the EPA. They're coming in and helping to solve for that. So I would find yourself a local commercial person who's familiar with that, and see if they can help you with that, because that can save you a ton of money. Because otherwise, if you have to do it yourself, I mean, I have my partner was talking to me about an old 7-Eleven deal where the 7-Eleven bought the property. It was an old gas station, and the remediation on that was over $600,000, just the remediation.
Wow.
Yeah. So it can be terribly expensive. So I would say that would be your best bet. That's the way that I would approach that.
But if someone were to come in wanting to buy it as a retail store, chances are they might not even be that interested in doing the environmental stuff.
That's true. I mean, me personally, whenever I look at, especially if it's an older building, I always recommend environmental. A good commercial agent is going to recommend that.
Right.
And the first level of environmental, they don't usually even take soil. It's just research. They go into the property records, they look back in history to see, well, what used to be here over time. And if there's anything that's a red flag, then they'll say, okay, we recommend, a tier
Soil
2.
sample.
Yeah, which is the tier 2, which they do a surface soil sample.
Okay.
And then the tier 3, the phase 3 environmental is where they actually bore into the ground, and they usually go down a few feet to get like an actual deep soil sample to find out like how deep is it, how bad is it, and they'll usually do a few of those across the property.
Okay, all right, interesting. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Anyone online, do you guys have any additional questions as it relates to the property types? No? Okay. So some resources for you guys to just be aware of before I let you guys go is for zoning. Zoning is going to be different from city to city, county to county, right? So the big thing that I would recommend for zoning is go to the just go on Google and just look up development code, right? Development code, and then put in whatever the name of the city is. And typically you'll find they're basically all of the code that's related to that particular municipality, and they'll define for you what it means to be a C1 or an M1 or a I4 or whatever the case may be, right? And that'll help determine what kind of use is being utilized. Future use map, again, just Google future use map and the name of the city, and that will identify what the city has determined a good future use would be for a particular property. So it might be currently zoned as industrial or retail, but future use may zone it as multifamily or residential, or it may be agricultural now, and they may say, oh, this would be a great retail or commercial use. What's good about future use is it allows you to determine like how easy it would be for you to flip it from what it currently is, let's say agricultural, to a commercial use. If they already have future use as commercial and they're good to go with that, then usually the transition for zoning is relatively easy because they've already said that this would be great for commercial use and will approve it if someone did a request for it in most cases. And then the development code is just like I said, it really kind of identifies the details that are that you're going to need to know as it relates to what is ultimately allowable on a particular property. If you're developing something, what are the development requirements for developing on a property? So those kinds of things. But if you're going to sell, I would definitely look into what the development code says and get familiar with it, because you can probably use that as part of your realtor remarks when you're talking about the property. Oh, it has future use of, right? And you can build a blah, 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 right? So if someone can look at it as a redevelopment project, they may consider doing that, right? Okay. And sometimes if the future use is really good, they may pay a premium for it.
Okay, good. Good.
All right, so that's pretty much it in a nutshell. This is pretty much our team here in our office. So if you guys have any questions about anything that's commercial related, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to be a resource, or any of my team will probably be happy to be a resource for you. My team is compiled with 3 people that are specifically on my team, which is myself, Adam, and Brantley. And then I have a Bob Proper is actually from another brokerage. He specializes in gas stations and development projects. So I leverage him because of his extensive knowledge. So anytime I have gas stations or really heavy duty development projects, I bring him into the fold because of his extensive knowledge. So even though he's not from our brokerage, he just has just a wealth of knowledge that it would take me years to be able to put together. So I'd rather bring him in on a deal, or even sometimes refer him a deal, rather than try to take on something like that that's going to be beyond my knowledge, my capacity to be able to fulfill that. Okay. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. So we're at 11:03. Sorry, going over 3 minutes. So there's you guys online, you guys have any questions before I let you guys go? I'm going to take silence as a no. Thank you guys for coming. I appreciate you guys. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. My name is Gus, and you can reach me at gus@mkgcommercial.com. If you have any questions, feel free to email me anytime. Gus at M like Mary, K like Killer, G like Gus, commercial.com. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Okay, so thank you guys for your time, and I will see you guys next month. Take care. Peace.